Margaret Lindstrom stood outside her brother-in-law's cabin with 2 flour sacks, a wooden mallet, and exactly $7 in coins while the season's first snow dusted the Elkhorn Mountains behind her. Her husband had been dead for 3 weeks. His brother, Eric, had ordered her to leave by sunset. Only 6 hours of daylight remained, and the almanac predicted the coldest winter in decades. Margaret was 41 years old, spoke English with a strong Swedish accent, and owned nothing beyond what she could carry. Within a month, temperatures were expected to fall to 20 degrees below zero. Not a single boarding house in Helena would accept a widow without references. The nearest farm where she might find work was 43 miles east, and she had no horse. But Margaret had spent the first 12 years of her life in Dalarna, Sweden, where her father worked as a charcoal burner in forests so harsh that Montana seemed almost tame by comparison. She understood something about surviving when the world appeared determined to kill you. Shelter was not the main problem. If the soil cooperated, she could dig a small earth-sheltered cabin into the hillside above Prickly Pear Creek in 2 days. The real problem was firewood. A woman living alone through a Montana winter in a 12-by-12-foot room would need at least 4 cords of split wood. That would had to remain dry. Wet fuel produced smoke instead of heat, and smoke trapped inside a confined space could make a person fall asleep and never wake up. Margaret had seen it happen to a Norwegian family in 1874. The usual answer was a separate woodshed, an 8-by-12-foot structure built from sawn lumber, with a tin roof and a raised floor. Materials alone cost between $30 and $40. Margaret had $7 and, if the weather held, 47 days before the first truly lethal freeze. She followed the creek south until the canyon narrowed and the north-facing slope became steep enough that snow would pile 8 feet deep there by January. Perfect. She found a place where an old landslide had carved a natural recess into the hill. It formed a rough semicircle, perhaps 11 feet across and 6 feet deep. The exposed rock curved inward like the inside of a barrel. If she could close the front without spending money she did not have, the hillside itself would shed rain and snow. The stone would hold heat from any fire nearby. The elevation also placed the site above the spring flood line, when Prickly Pear Creek became a violent torrent. For men watched her from the Helena Lumber Company storage yard 200 yards downstream. She could feel their doubt like a physical weight. By noon, she had cleared the brush and begun the real work. The creek bottom was thick with young cottonwood and willow. None of the trees were more than 4 inches in diameter, but they were green enough to bend without snapping. Using a borrowed bow saw, which she promised to return before dark, Margaret cut 12 saplings. Each was about 14 feet long and as thick as her wrist. Her father had taught her the secret years earlier. Green wood bends, dry wood breaks, and a curve forced into a living branch today becomes permanent tomorrow, if the work is done correctly. At the mouth of the recess, she drove 2 stakes into the ground exactly 11 feet apart. Then she buried one end of the first sapling 18 inches deep on the left side, bent the trunk overhead in a smooth arc, and fixed the other end into the earth on the right. The sapling formed a perfect half circle, like one rib of a covered wagon. She repeated the process 11 more times, spacing each arch 16 inches apart until she had built a frame resembling the entrance to a tunnel cut into the hillside. Tom Brannan arrived around 2 in the afternoon. He had once supervised a Northern Pacific Railroad survey crew before taking a mining claim near Marysville, and he had little patience for fools. "Mrs. Lindstrom," he said, removing his hat, "that is an interesting thing you are building." "It is a woodshed, Mr. Brannan." "A woodshed?" He studied the bent saplings, which were already beginning to hold their curved shape. There were no walls, no roof, and no floor. "Not yet," Margaret replied. "I do not mean to interfere, but you may have 6 weeks before snow buries this canyon. Are you planning to survive the winter in a hole fenced with sticks?" "I am planning to keep 4 cords of firewood dry," she said. "I will live somewhere else." Brannan looked at the remaining saplings she had already cut, then at the stone hollow, and finally back at her. "Cottonwood and willow will not carry a heavy snow load. The first storm will flatten whatever you put here." "The snow will strike the slope 20 feet above this place and pass over it," Margaret answered. "I am not building high enough for the drift to catch it." He did not look convinced, but he did not argue. He replaced his hat and walked away, shaking his head. The sun was already leaning toward the horizon when Margaret began weaving. She had saved the longest and most flexible willow shoots, hundreds of them, each 6 to 8 feet long and no thicker than a pencil. Starting at ground level, she threaded them horizontally through the upright arches, over, under, over, under. She pulled every strip tight before adding the next. It was basket weaving on the scale of architecture. By dusk, she had completed a 3-foot-high woven wall that curved smoothly away from the rock on both sides and began closing the opening. The weave was tight enough to slow the wind but open enough to let moisture escape. Margaret returned the bow saw to its owner and spent her first night beneath a top stretched between 2 trees, listening to coyotes argue in the distance. September 18th brought a frost that killed the last summer wildflowers. Margaret kept working, weaving willow until her fingers bled and the wall rose to 5 feet. The structure now looked half buried in the hillside and half grown from living wood, curved like an overturned boat. Several miners stopped to stare. Most left confused. Samuel Chen stayed. He had come from Guangdong Province in 1869 to work on the Transcontinental Railroad. When the railroad work ended, he remained in Montana and established a small freight business carrying supplies to mining camps. He had seen buildings raised in many ways on 2 continents. "This design," he said in careful English, "reminds me of structures in northern China. Earth and wood together." "I am Swedish," Margaret replied, "but the principle is probably the same. Use what you have." "The curve is clever," Samuel said. "It spreads the weight. But these willow branches will dry and shrink. Gaps will open. I have considered that. If you seal them properly, they may not. But lime costs money. Cloth costs money." "Clay is free," Margaret said. "There is a deposit 200 yards uphill, dense enough to hold its shape." Samuel tilted his head, reconsidering her plan. "You mean to build something like wattle and daub?" "Something close to it." For the first time, he smiled. "It may truly work, if the clay does not crack when it freezes." "It will not crack if I mix in enough grass and manure," Margaret said. "The Mongols have done it for 1,000 years. The Swedes discovered something similar about 500 years ago. I am merely late to the celebration." Over the next 4 days, Margaret completed the woven wall and began applying the outer skin. She mixed creek clay with dried grass, horse manure gathered free from a nearby stable, and a small amount of water until it formed a heavy paste. She forced the mixture into every opening in the willow lattice from both sides, adding layer after layer until the walls were nearly 3 inches thick. The work was slow, filthy, and punishing. Her shoulders screamed by the end of each day. But the fragile-looking framework became something solid, water-resistant, windproof, and strong enough to laugh at a blizzard. The roof was more difficult. Margaret could not afford sawn boards. She could not buy tin. Cedar shingles were beyond her reach. But bark cost nothing. The ponderosa pines along the ridge above her had thick, plated bark that peeled away in pieces about 2 feet long and 14 inches wide. Over 2 days, she gathered 73 sections, climbing until her arms and hands were sticky with resin. Then she overlapped the bark like shingles across the curved frame, fixing each piece in place with bent willow pegs. The bark followed the arch naturally. Rain would strike it and run off. Snow would slide down the rounded surface instead of gathering on top. People began to pay attention. This is something worth understanding about frontier communities in 1876. Information moved more slowly than the weather, but judgment traveled faster than either. Whenever someone tried something unfamiliar, especially a woman alone, especially an immigrant, especially someone without land or money, the community divided into 3 groups. Some hoped she would succeed. Others wanted her to fail so they could feel superior. A third group genuinely wished to help but did not know how. Helena had representatives from all 3 groups watching Margaret work. Father Heinrich Müller represented the skeptical religious faction. He was a Lutheran minister who had emigrated from Bavaria in 1868 and firmly believed in traditional social order. On September 24th, he approached while Margaret waterproofed the bark roof with a mixture of pine resin and rendered fat. "Mrs. Lindstrom, the congregation has discussed your situation. We can offer you domestic work in exchange for a room in the church basement." Margaret did not stop working. "That is generous, Father. What kind of domestic work?" "Cleaning, washing, preparing meals for church gatherings, the usual duties." "How many hours a day?" "Perhaps 30 hours a week. Perhaps 35, depending on need." "And the room?" 8 feet by 10. Shared facilities. Adequate heat. Margaret climbed down the ladder she had made from pine branches, wiped resin from her hands, and looked directly at him. "Father Muller, I appreciate the offer. But I am 41 years old. I have buried a husband and 2 children, and I have worked every day of my life since I was 7. I do not intend to become a servant in a church basement. Pride is a sin, Mrs. Lindstrom. So is wasting what God gave you, she answered. He gave me 2 hands and a mind. I intend to use both. The minister's expression darkened. This structure is improper, indecent. A Christian woman should not live in a hole in the ground like an animal. I do not plan to live in it, Margaret said. It is a woodshed. My dugout is 20 feet east of here. She had not begun the dugout yet, but the minister did not need to know that. It will fail, Muller said. And when it does, the church's offer may no longer be available. Then I suppose I had better not fail, Margaret replied. If you are watching because you value the practical knowledge people once built their lives around, methods that truly worked when there was no backup plan, no hardware store, and no one to call for help, subscribe to this channel. We document the techniques that allowed ordinary people to survive conditions that would kill many of us today. Press the subscribe button and help preserve this knowledge before it disappears entirely. By September 28th, Margaret had spent 5 of her $7. A box of 90 nails cost 60 cents. A pound of rendered fat for waterproofing cost 40 cents. 2 yards of burlap for the door cost 30 cents. She traded her late husband's pocket watch for a small iron stove missing one leg, then supported it with stones. The remaining $2 had to buy enough cornmeal and beans to last through October, provided she ate sparingly and supplemented her food with anything she could gather, trap, or catch. The woodshed was now functional. It measured 11 feet across, 6 feet deep where it met the stone wall, and 7 feet high at the center of the arch. The interior covered roughly 66 square feet. The curved walls and roof formed a self-supporting shell that needed no internal posts or beams. Small ventilation gaps near the top allowed air to circulate, preventing condensation and mold while still keeping out rain and snow. Now came the test. Margaret spent 3 days cutting and splitting firewood, mostly lodgepole pine. It grew thickly in the valleys above the creek and burned cleanly when properly seasoned. She worked from sunrise until dark, swinging a splitting maul until her palms blistered, then bled, and finally hardened. She stacked every piece carefully inside the arch shelter. Heavy logs went on the bottom for stability. Smaller pieces were placed above to improve airflow. The entire stack leaned slightly so moisture would drain away. By October 1st, 3.5 cords reached almost to the ceiling, leaving only enough space for her to squeeze inside and remove what she needed. The first serious storm arrived on October 3rd. It brought no snow, only bitter rain that fell for 36 straight hours and turned the creek into a violent brown current. The temperature dropped to 34 degrees. Wind gusts reached 40 miles per hour. Margaret sat inside her half-finished dugout, still little more than a pit covered with canvas, and watched water pour down the slope above the woodshed. Every drop ran across the bark roof and away from the entrance. The curved shape diverted the flow to both sides. Not a single leak appeared. No water penetrated the clay-covered walls. When the storm ended, she opened the burlap door and checked the wood. It was dry as bone. She pulled a split log from the center of the pile and examined it closely. The moisture level appeared unchanged from before the rain, perhaps 14%, ideal for burning.
No mold. No dampness.
No water marks. Tom Brannan appeared later that day with an unfamiliar expression. Mrs. Lindstrom, I owe you an apology. Margaret was digging her living shelter, throwing one shovelful of earth after another onto the mound that would eventually become a sod roof. For what, Mr. Brannan? For assuming you did not know what you were doing. He pointed toward the woodshed. I inspected it after the storm. That is solid work. More than solid, it is intelligent work. Thank you. What did the whole thing cost? Margaret leaned on the shovel. Let me think. Nails, fat, burlap, and the food I ate while building it. About $6.20 by my latest count. Brannan stared at her. I paid $38 for my woodshed last year. Sawn lumber, tin roof, raised floor. Yours is better. Yours is probably prettier. Pretty does not matter when a person is trying not to freeze, Brannan said. Would you object if I brought a few men here? I know 3 miners who need firewood storage before the snow comes, and they are nearly out of money. Bring them, Margaret said. The news spread in the way it always does through a small settlement. By the middle of October, Margaret had taught 7 different people how to build a shelter from bent saplings. She charged nothing for the knowledge. She only said that if anyone had spare food or supplies, she would be grateful. Soon she possessed more dried beans, smoked venison, and cornmeal than she could eat in 3 months. A mining engineer gave her a wool blanket that had belonged to his late mother. Samuel Chen brought a bundle of Chinese newspapers for insulation, along with a jar of pickled vegetables prepared by his wife. The community shifted around her. Margaret had proven something more valuable than respectability or church approval. She could solve problems with observation, thought, and labor. In a place where survival was never guaranteed, that meant everything. True winter arrived on November 12th. During the night, the temperature fell to 8 degrees below zero. 6 inches of snow came first, then 8 more, then another 12. Wind screamed across the Continental Divide at 60 miles per hour, building drifts that buried fence lines and made the road to Helena impassable for 3 days. This was the kind of weather that killed the unprepared, cold that found every crack in every wall, wind that pulled warmth from any structure built carelessly. Margaret's dugout remained at 48 degrees inside without a fire, warmed only by the thermal mass of the earth. When she needed heat for cooking or comfort, she fed lodgepole pine into the little 3-legged stove. Every log burned clean and hot because it had remained perfectly dry. But another crisis was coming, one that had nothing to do with Margaret's own survival. On November 19th, a Swedish immigrant family named Johansson arrived in Helena after a disastrous journey from Minnesota. A land speculator had promised them property, only for them to discover that he had been selling claims he did not own. They had no money, 3 children younger than 8, and winter had already sealed the territory shut. The father, Lars, had developed a cough that sounded as if it were tearing him apart from the inside. His wife, Karen, was 6 months pregnant and so exhausted that she sometimes fainted. Father Muller temporarily placed them in the church basement, but made it clear they could not remain after Christmas. The basement was needed for church functions, he explained, and able-bodied people were expected to support themselves. The unspoken message was obvious. Lars was too sick to work. Karen was too far into her pregnancy. The children were too young to be considered useful. Margaret heard about them from Samuel Chen, who had been hired to carry their few belongings from the station. That evening, she went to the church and found Karen trying to calm the children in a dim, cold room that smelled of mildew and defeat. "How much firewood do you have?" Margaret asked. Karen looked up, startled. "Perhaps enough for 2 weeks, if we are careful. Lars cannot cut more in his condition. You need at least 4 cords to reach spring." "I know," Karen said quietly, "but we have no money for wood, and I do not know who would sell to us with Lars so ill." Margaret calculated quickly. Her own shed held enough for the winter, with a small margin to spare. If necessary, she could cut more. Lodgepole pine filled the hills, and she still had strength. But the Johanssons were facing a death sentence without fuel. Lars's cough suggested he might not live until spring regardless. The question was not whether to help. It was how to help without making them feel like objects of charity, because dignity matters even to people who are dying. "I need workers," Margaret said, though it was not true. "Before spring, I plan to build 2 more storage structures, one for root vegetables and another for tools. I pay in firewood rather than money. 1 day of work from the children earns 1 week's worth of split logs. They stack, and I split. That is fair." Karen's eyes filled with tears. She understood exactly what Margaret was doing, but the arrangement allowed her to accept the help. It is more than fair. For the next 6 weeks, the Johansson children, 4, 6, and 7 years old, came to Margaret's property every day after their morning lessons with Father Muller. She taught them how to stack firewood properly, how to read clouds and changing weather, and how to identify trees that burned cleanly instead of filling a room with smoke. Margaret split the logs, and the children stacked them in a corner of the church basement reserved for their family. By Christmas, they had enough fuel to last until April. Lars died on January 8, 1877. The cough was tuberculosis, a disease no one there could prevent or cure. But he died warm, in a room heated by wood his children had helped stack, surrounded by people who came because Margaret had reminded them that helping one another was the only reliable way to survive. Karen gave birth to a healthy girl in February. She named the baby Margaret. For those who value original records, here is what the historical trail appears to show. The Helena Weekly Herald published a short notice on March 3, 1877, describing ingenious frontier architecture developed by industrious local residents to solve the problem of storing firewood. The article specifically mentioned domed structures woven from willow and covered with clay. They had been built at minimal expense and had proved surprisingly effective in severe weather. No individual names were given. Newspapers of that era rarely credited women's labor, but the timing and description aligned closely with Margaret's work. More importantly, the 1880 Montana Territory Census listed Margaret Lindstrom as a property owner whose land was valued at $180, a substantial amount for a woman living alone at the time. The census recorded her occupation as teacher of practical building methods. By then, Margaret had helped 43 families construct various shelters using salvaged and gathered materials. She charged according to what people could afford, sometimes money, sometimes labor, and sometimes only a promise that they would help someone else later. The arched firewood shelter spread across Montana Territory and into Wyoming and Dakota. Variations appeared. Some builders used pine saplings instead of willow. Others incorporated reclaimed timber. Some added stone foundations. But the central idea remained unchanged. Work with natural curves. Use the materials already available. Build for the climate you actually have, not the climate you wish you had. If you are still here, if you have followed a story about a widow building a woodshed in 1876, then you understand something important. This is not merely a story. It is a record of human problem-solving under pressure. It is evidence that intelligence and determination can matter more than money or social standing when survival is at stake. Subscribe and help preserve these accounts. Press the button and support the archiving of knowledge that once genuinely saved lives. The technical advantages were real and measurable. A conventional sawn lumber woodshed in Montana Territory cost between $30 and $45 in 1876. Margaret's design cost less than $7. Traditional sheds required purchased boards, nails, hinges, and roofing materials. Her construction needed only nails and burlap. Everything else could be collected or salvaged. Ordinary sheds stood exposed to wind and demanded constant maintenance as boards warped and gaps opened. Margaret's design was partly embedded in the hillside, supported itself, and needed almost no upkeep because its materials shifted together as temperatures changed. But the most important difference was the way each design kept wood dry. A conventional shed protected firewood by lifting it above the ground and covering it with a roof. Margaret's shelter protected firewood by becoming part of the landscape and using the Earth's thermal mass to regulate moisture. The comparison was not close. $7 instead of $40. 7 days of labor instead of 3 weeks. One builder instead of a crew. And the practical result was the same. In both cases, the firewood remained dry enough to burn cleanly. Why do we no longer build this way? Because most of us do not need to. We have hardware stores, commercial lumber, national supply chains, construction codes, inspectors, and professionals who can do the work for money, and that is not a bad thing. Modern construction is generally safer, stronger, and more durable. No one is suggesting that society abandon engineered lumber and return to woven willow. But something is lost when we forget that careful observation can replace money, and that practical understanding can be more valuable than credentials. The person everyone dismisses may know the one thing that saves your life. Margaret Lindstrom died in 1903 at the age of 68. By frontier standards, she was prosperous. She owned 320 acres, a solid house near Helena, and shares in 2 mining operations. Her obituary in the Helena Independent mentioned her contribution to practical architecture and noted that she had taught an entire generation of settlers to adapt traditional methods to frontier conditions. What the obituary did not say was that she had started with $7 and a deadline. She transformed those $7 into security by watching how trees grew and remembering lessons her father had taught her in a Swedish forest 40 years earlier. The original arched woodshed stood until 1912, when a wildfire swept through Prickly Pear Canyon and destroyed everything in its path. By then, however, the design had already spread throughout the Mountain West. Remnants may still exist if a person knows where to look. Collapsed frames in abandoned gold camps, overgrown stone foundations, or an occasional photograph in a historical society archive showing a curved structure that appears to have grown directly from a hillside. There is a broader principle here, one that applies to every era and every situation in which resources are scarce and the stakes are high. The best solutions often come from people who cannot afford to fail and who pay attention to how the world truly works rather than how they wish it worked. Margaret could not afford sawn boards, so she studied the way young trees bent. She could not buy a metal roof, so she noticed how bark carried water away. She could not build high above the ground, so she watched how snow moved across the terrain. Every limitation forced her to observe more carefully, think more deeply, and discover answers that wealthier people might never have noticed. This is not an attempt to romanticize poverty. Suffering is not noble. It is simply the reality that necessity can sharpen observation in ways comfort rarely does. And this is what ties the entire story together. Margaret did not save only herself. She helped save the Johansson family. She taught 43 other families how to build more effectively. She created a body of knowledge that traveled across 3 territories and helped people survive for decades. All of it began because she refused to believe that having no money meant having no choices. That $7 woodshed was never merely a place to store firewood. It proved that the system was not fixed, that ingenuity mattered, and that one determined person could change the equation for everyone nearby. So when you face your own winter, whatever form it takes, whatever deadline it brings, and whatever resources you lack, remember Margaret Lindstrom. She had $7, 6 weeks, and a brother-in-law who wanted her gone. She turned those limitations into a shelter that worked better than structures costing 6 times as much. She turned the knowledge into a career as a teacher. She turned the career into a legacy that outlived several generations. The question is not whether you have enough resources. The question is whether you are looking closely enough to recognize what is already available. If this story meant something to you, if you believe there is value in preserving knowledge about how people survived when no safety net remained, do one more thing before you leave. Press the like button. It tells the algorithm to show this story to others who may need it. Every like is a vote for the idea that practical knowledge matters, that real solutions deserve attention, and that stories about human ingenuity are worth preserving. Margaret Lindstrom's arched woodshed kept firewood dry for 6 winters, until she built a proper house and no longer needed it. But the principle survived. Use what you have. Nature offers patterns if you are observant enough to read them. Poverty and isolation do not always have to become a death sentence. Those ideas mattered in 1876, and they still matter now. The world has changed. The tools have changed. The fundamental truth has not. Intelligence and determination can overcome almost anything. And the person everyone underestimates may be the one who discovers how to survive what is coming. Margaret knew that. Now you know it too.